breaking through the rhetoric, breaking down the issues from the nation's capital. This is DC Breakdown.
A federal ruling in California could have implications for teachers' unions across the country. We are breaking down the details of the decision with Dennis Van Rokel, the president of the National Education Association. Always good to have you here on DC Breakdown, Dennis. So let's get this straight. 9 students filed suit saying their education suffered because they were stuck in classrooms with awful teachers who did not challenge them, inspire them, or maintain basic discipline. That is what the students, Vergara versus State of California, that's what they said. What do you have to say about just the basics of the lawsuit?
Well, from a student's point of view, I think there are 2 things that are very important. Number one, if there's an ineffective teacher in the classroom, we need to have a system that is fair and efficient in time and resources to remove that person. But the second thing that's important from a perspective of a student is not to have good teachers leave the classroom for bad reasons. But I think the most important factor is that they should never be there in the first place.
Right.
The idea that you open the doors wide, let anyone in, and then say, if you're really bad, we want to be able to easily fire you. I think there should be quality at the front door. No one should be allowed to be the teacher of record, to be in charge of 30 or 35 kids and not be properly trained, certified, and licensed. It shouldn't happen.
So a lot of places, and tell me if I'm wrong, they give teachers X amount of time, let's say 18 months, to prove that they can or cannot handle a classroom, and then they are tenured. Is that right, or do I have it wrong?
And let's define the word tenure. What it really means is the right to a hearing, a due process. So in some states, California, it's 2 years. Some states, it's as many as 5. But in that time period, they don't have any right to a hearing. At the end of any given year, the district can say, we've decided we are not rehiring you next year, and they're gone. So they have this, what often is called a probationary period. After that, if they grant you what's often called tenure, then you have a right to a hearing. So you can't be just arbitrarily dismissed after that.
So is it the same kind of tenure we're talking about with respect to people on the bench? Let's say the Supreme Court, do we say they have tenure, or they're just allowed to be there for life?
It's definitely not like tenure on the Supreme Court.
Right.
Definitely not an appointment for life. What it really is that they have processes in place that if you're ineffective, they have rules that have been negotiated usually with the union and the employer, and it says this is how we will do it. Number one, we'll tell you what your deficiencies are. There will be some time period which you have an opportunity to improve, and at the end of that, if you can't or won't improve, then you are dismissed. But you have a right to that process and a hearing. When you're in those first years, all they have to do is say, we're not rehiring. So They do have a point. And I think that gives a real responsibility to a district. When you hire a new teacher, you ought to pay close attention during those first 2, 3, or 4 years to say, is this person someone we want as a professional in our system? Because
if not, we are potentially then left with someone who gets on the tenure track, and then it becomes a little more difficult.
Well, then you have to provide a reason and a hearing and notice. But I can't emphasize enough that I think the real flaw in the system is that we don't do our diligence at the beginning. In other countries that do well in international comparisons, the idea that someone could ever get into the classroom who was not competent, they say that couldn't happen. And yet we allow that in the beginning. It shouldn't happen. We ought to make sure that day one, you're profession ready. And then with good evaluation, you ought to be in professional development. You ought to allow a person to grow from day one until your last day in the classroom. I know my last 9 years of teaching were my best because I had learned so much and I had received additional training. And so I just believe I was learning my profession better and better each year.
I think some of us feel that a lot of teachers, once they hear their tenure, they're like, oh, okay, I get to sit back and relax now, and they don't do what you did, which was work your very hardest. I think the very notion of tenure oftentimes for some of us means that you're not going to give it your best.
My experience over 46 years in the profession, 23 in the classroom, and working with teachers and educators all across this country, there is nothing further from the idea that once I have the right to due process, I will coast. That is not who they are and what they do. Under the worst conditions, they absolutely give their best every single day. It's who they are, or they wouldn't do that job. It's pretty hard to coast when you have 30 or 35 kids in front of you in a classroom.
Well,
you give your best every single day.
Well, I think that you may be right that a lot of people do, but I don't think the case can be made that all teachers do.
No, and that's why it's important to have a process. If someone is not the way they should be, there needs to be a process where they're given notice of deficiencies, opportunity to improve, and if they can't or won't, they should be gone. We all agree, all of us, especially those of us who work in the profession, we do not want incompetent people in the classroom. No child deserves that.
Exactly. And that is something that the judge also pointed out. What do you think of the judge basically striking down tenure for teachers in California? Do you feel like this is the beginning of something big that's going to happen in other states as well? Do you agree in any way with any part of what the judge had to say?
I think they've already announced they're going to go to other states. I think it'll be very interesting to see it in the appeal so that they reconsider and look at the evidence presented.
And let's make it clear, while this case is being appealed, the judge says, I'm not touching anything.
Right.
So my ruling is not in effect yet until the process is appealed.
I really don't believe this lawsuit was about kids at all. I think it was about attacking on the profession. I think one of the unintended or intended consequences will be making it more difficult to attract and retain quality people into the profession. You don't build a profession by doing that. And the worst part to me is that those three laws, I don't think really does anything to solve a very real problem, and that is there are children being underserved in this nation, and it's not just with the experience and the certification and the licensure of the teachers. They're going to school in schools that don't have equitable learning conditions. They don't have the kind of standards and curriculum aligned with the standards they should have. There is a huge problem. If we really want to change what's happening to kids, we need to look at school readiness, making sure that every child is ready with early childhood education. We need to look at those conditions of learning. I was in a school not a month ago where there are only 2 bathrooms, and there are 300 kids in the school, one for the boys, one for the girls, in the basement. And in the hallway in the basement where they pick up their lunches, they always hope it doesn't rain in the morning because it floods. And you go, why is that?
Right.
It shouldn't be. So you need to have equity, which doesn't necessarily mean equal. Equity in terms of resources, in a quality workforce, all of that is necessary because our real goal is to do what's right with kids so that every child has an opportunity to follow that dream, as we say. But more importantly, as adults, we need to remove the obstacles that deny that child that opportunity.
I want to ask you about something else quickly. New Orleans no longer having a public school system. It's all now a chartered school system. What do you think about that?
Well, the results are in and it has failed. And that to me is a real horrible thing. It's not doing better than it was at all, which means that we ignored the root cause of what was happening there, and we did things that didn't impact the cause.
What was the root cause, do you think?
I think the root cause is not dealing with the needs of students at the beginning, that early childhood, and then ensuring the equity of conditions of learning, of making sure and ensuring that a quality workforce is in every single one of those schools, making sure that every school had high standards. We don't have that, and they didn't create that with this new system.
So the new system, does the new system have early learning for kids?
No.
So we're missing that portion of it.
Right. We're not, I mean, when you look at what is it that stops students from succeeding, what are the obstacles that are in their way, and then what do you do to address those? So some kids, any family of means provides what they can before they ever go to school, early childhood education and good environment. Some parents are not able to do that. As a nation, as a society, don't we want that for every child? And isn't it our responsibility to do that? When they come to school not ready to learn, they're behind from day one. We need to address that. The equity of the conditions I mentioned before and the buildings, we need to address that. And if you look in this country where there are untrained, unlicensed, uncertified teachers, I guarantee that the vast majority of those will be in schools where parents happen to be in high poverty, and too often it's where students are students of color. We need to address that. It's wrong.
So you don't think the chartered process is working?
No, it isn't a silver bullet that if we simply change schools to charters, it'll
all
help.
good.
Of all the charters in the country, about 17% are doing better. That's not a record that says,
Right.
this is the answer.
Because there are many here in D.C.
Many
I
charters
think this is
in
the third
DC.
highest
Yeah.
chartered school.
And as you
area.
go from state to state, the laws that govern charter schools vary immensely. Some are very accountable, others are not accountable
So
at
Head
all.
Start does not apply to chartered schools.
I'm not sure on that.
Mm-hmm.
I believe they can get federal funds for Head Start. But it's, a reporter once asked me, what's the one thing I would do to change education? I said to him, stop asking for the one thing. It isn't one
Right.
thing. It's a complex
Yeah.
system. We have a federal government, 50 states, 15,000 school districts, 90,000 buildings. And if you think you can just do this one little
Right.
thing and this system will change, it won't.
Right. Well, I guess we're looking at similar lawsuits, as you said, in Connecticut, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, as well as Oregon. So we'll have to see what becomes of the California decision as it is appealed and as these school reformers, as they call themselves, roll out the next process in all these other different states. We'll have to keep in touch with you, Dennis
absolutely.
Van Rokel, president of NEA, the National Education Association. Thank you so much for
You bet.
dropping
Thank
by
you for
again.
having
We
me.
always enjoy you.